Hello, welcome to this short video on the French seam. So this is actually a mini video in a wider series on the very basics of sewing. So this is on the French seam. As with all the other videos, anything that I actually use in these videos, I'll go online and I'll find a good value link for anything that I've used, and I'll link it in the comments or description or something. So the French seam, as with our other 4 specialised seams that we're doing, they hide your raw edges inside the seam as you sew it. So your raw edges that are left at the end of a seam are taken care of. You don't have to do anything else with it. The seam takes care of it. So also, the French seam itself is actually a very strong seam. So it usually even lasts a lot longer than the fabric. So it's not as strong as the half flat felled seam, which we did in the last video, and it's not as strong as the flat felled seam, but it's a lot stronger than the regular seam. It's great for delicate fabrics, used a lot in women's designer clothing, expensive lingerie, and other things that use delicate fabrics. It's used a lot in that because it's a very strong seam, but it's good for delicate fabrics because the second stitch that makes it much stronger than just a regular seam, that second stitch is much closer to the first stitch. So if you pull on the seam, it puts a lot less strain on the fabric between the stitches, because if there's a bigger distance, then the fabric between these 2 stitches gets strained. Whereas, because there's a much closer distance, it prevents the tearing of those delicate fabrics. So it's very good for delicate fabrics, this seam. Also, as I said, it hides the raw edges completely, and it's fine for curves. You just need to remember to make your, like the triangles or the cuts in the seam allowance, as I described in the regular seam video. So you can do the French seam on curves, and it's very good. So we're now going to actually sew a French seam. So as we sew, we need to press it at a few points in the sewing. So when we are pressing, we just need to remember that the surface needs to be able to handle the heat, and so does our fabric. So for the French seam, what we're actually going to do is we put bad side to bad side. So this is going to be the good side of our finished garment. Normally, on a regular seam, it would go good side to good side, but with this one, we're going to go bad side to do this first stitch. So one more thing with this seam, as well as being bad side to bad side, is that the first seam that we're going to do is actually 1/4 of an inch. So the full seam allowance of this is 5/8 of an inch, or 1.5 centimeters. But for this first stitch, we're only going to do 1/4, which is 2/8 of an inch. What we then want to do is trim it to 1/8 of an inch. So once it's 1/8 of an inch, we are then going to sew it some more. And I recognise that I've picked the absolute worst possible fabric to try and do this demonstration with. So this is now cut to 1/8 of an inch. So the reason that we have to sew it to 1/4 of an inch and then cut to 1/8 of an inch is because with the traditional finished seam that we'll do in a second, that it needs this to be 1/8 of an inch. So I'll explain later how you can do it without making this cut, but it's just a little bit more complicated. So I'll explain it after we've done the seam, so you'll be able to understand it better. And if you are sewing on a curve, this is when you make your cuts and triangles and notches to this seam allowance. So now the next step, before we do any more sewing, is that we want to fold this over. So to do that, we want it to be pressed on this side so that it's nice and flat. And it doesn't really matter what is happening to the seam allowance on the other side. But once that's flat, what we then want to do is fold it as sharply as we can here. And then once we've folded it sharply, we then need to press it. So where you press this is important because that's where the finished sewing, the finished seam will be. So unlike me, you want to take your time on making sure that that fold is accurate so that when we sew it, it's a good fold. So what we are now going to do is sew this for the remaining seam allowance. So we started off with 5/8 of an inch and we've already sewn 1/4 of an inch. So we've got 3/8 of an inch left. So what we want to do is line this up with 3/8 of an inch on our machine, or if we're hand sewing, we want to sew this 3/8 of an inch away. Now this is why it's important that we cut this to 1/8 of an inch. Because we don't want, once we do sew this, it'll look like that, and we don't want the fabric to be coming out. So I'm now now that I've pressed this so it's a sharp fold, I'm now going to sew it 3/8 of an inch. So I need to find 3/8 of an inch, line it up, and then sew. So what we are now left with is a finished French seam. So this is what that looks like. So this is the bad side of the fabric. Bad side to bad side is how we sewed it. And on the good side, this is before it's been pressed. This is what it looks like. So after it's pressed, it would look sharper and neater than this. So the next step to do is actually to pick a side that we want to press this to, and then press it. And that will mean that if it's pressed well and it's not with an awful fabric like this one, then it will tend to lie that way from now on. And if you press it from the other side as well, you can make sure that it's sharp. So this is the French seam. So if you recall, we sewed it bad side to bad side with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then we cut that 1/4 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch. And then we turned it round, we folded and pressed on that fold here, and then once we had done that, we then sewed it to the remaining 3/8 of an inch, so that the total was the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that was the French seam. So in the next video we're going to do something called the true flat felled seam, which is an immensely strong seam, insanely strong, probably stronger than any fabric that you'll ever have. So it's very, very strong. It is quite complicated beforehand, but then once you sew it, it's actually very easy to sew. Like with these other seams, it encapsulates the raw edges as you sew it. So that's in the next video, the flat felled seam.